Alcohol has had an interesting journey through American history. Its status and legality have fluctuated as the social mindset has shifted over time, and alcoholic drinks have played innumerable roles in American culture, society, and economy. The story of alcohol in America begins with the story of America itself. From the beginning, alcohol has been an important part of American society. The first English settlers brought with them large amounts of beer and wine. In the very beginning of the colonial period, the colonists drank imported beer and wine, but soon they established their own breweries and distilleries to make their own beverages. Wine was the drink of choice for the higher class, while beer and a bit later Caribbean rum were favored by the general public. The production of distilled spirits in the colonies became an important economic portion of the triangle trade and contributed to the economic idea of mercantilism. In the 17th and 18th centuries, alcohol was drunk very widely for both pleasure and safety. In many cases, public sources of water were contaminated and unsafe to drink. The fermentation process made alcohol safe to drink, and it was widely consumed in its various forms. After the Revolution, American drinkers lost most access to rum from the Caribbean, so they turned instead to whiskey, which would be a mainstay of American alcohol for the next century. In 1790, the average American drank 5.8 gallons of pure alcohol per year. And they loved their booze too. In 1791, Congress passed a tax on whiskey, which sparked massive resistance, especially from small independent distilleries who relied on the drink for income. In 1794, a group of protesters in Maryland formed an armed resistance to the tax and raised such a ruckus that George Washington personally led the National Army to put down the so-called Whiskey Rebellion. Alcohol only became more popular during the early 1800s, reaching its all-time peak in 1830, when the average American consumed 7 gallons of pure alcohol per year. However, as ubiquitous as alcohol was then, not everyone was so enthusiastic about it. One of the earliest well-known anti-alcohol documents was An Inquiry into the Effects of Ardent Spirits upon the Human Body and Mind, with an account of the means of preventing and of the remedies for curing them, published in 1784, in which Benjamin Rush asserts that poverty and misery, crimes and infamy, diseases and death are all the natural and usual consequences of the intemperate use of ardent spirits. Rush's inquiry likely inspired the earliest temperance movements and began a century-and-a-half-long battle against alcohol. The acute rise in alcohol consumption in the early 19th century was what first gave the temperance movement widespread support. Large numbers of people began to advocate for temperance and bans on the manufacture and sale of alcohol as early as the late 1700s, when organizations supporting temperance were being formed across the country. The movement grew, and the temperance publications spread the ideals of the movement and attracted more support, condemning the use of alcohol, and as time went by, the temperance movement continued to grow in popularity. In 1826, the American Temperance Society was founded, and by 1836 it had over 1 million members. In 1838, both Maine and Massachusetts passed laws restricting the sale of alcohol in quantities less than 15 gallons. And in 1851, Maine passed a law which banned the production and sale of alcoholic beverages. This so-called Maine law inspired legislation from 12 other states throughout the 1850s. The movement was deeply intertwined with religion. Both Protestant and Catholic churches promoted the movement, some advocating partial restriction and others total prohibition. They emphasized the connection between alcoholism and unfaithfulness, greed, infidelity, and a general moral failing. At first, these groups were small and lacked widespread influence, but by the 1840s, this array of different perspectives had generally coalesced into a movement for prohibition. And by the 1850s, a national prohibition law seemed all but inevitable. However, a certain large event put a pin in the burgeoning movement: the Civil War. The issue of slavery began to dominate politics in the 1850s, and it overwhelmed virtually all other popular movements. Women's rights and temperance were put on hold throughout the Civil War and during Reconstruction. People lost concern for such petty issues as alcoholism, and, especially for the North, alcohol suddenly became a very important economic asset. The federal government began to institute taxes on alcoholic beverages which supported the war effort and made a ban on alcohol unfeasible. Pushed back by slavery and the war, temperance mostly faded away. In 1850, Americans only consumed 2.1 gallons of pure alcohol per year, which, as a matter of fact, is lower than today's average consumption. Clearly, temperance had made its mark, and though it had gone through a lull after Reconstruction fizzled out in the early 1870s, temperance rose once again. New organizations, like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, and the Catholic Total Abstinence Union of America, CTAU, spread the cause of temperance through education and advocacy. These organizations also tackled issues such as women's suffrage, domestic violence, and workers' rights. Many of the activists who participated in these reforms also went on to drive the progressive movement. One strategy of the WTCU was to make clean water more accessible. As many people still relied on alcohol for its safety, they constructed fountains that made drinkable water freely available to the public, as well as beautifying the communities they were placed in. This proved to be a successful effort, and many fountains were built across the country, some of which are still standing today. The movement continued to gain momentum, and in 1880, the national average per capita consumption of alcohol had fallen to 1.72 gallons of pure alcohol per year. In 1881, Kansas became the first state to outlaw alcohol in its constitution, and others soon followed. Get some more of this. Of course, as with any reform, there was resistance. Alcohol producers had their livelihoods at stake, and so they advocated heavily against the movement. They continued to promote the use of alcohol as a positive good, and pushed their temperate opponents away by criticizing the influence of women in the movement and politics in general. Much of this resistance was highlighted in court cases, which debated the idea of prohibition. Some ruled against it, but most upheld it, and cases like Mugler v. Kansas and Crowley v. Christensen continued to strengthen the movement. Still, alcohol was very popular, especially among the many industrial workers in large cities, which were on the rise. Brewers supported the proliferation of saloons in these cities, which became places for city dwellers to interact over food and drink and to relax after a long day's work. In post-Civil War cities, these saloons spread rapidly, acting as centers for cultural development for their many patrons. However, these saloons also caused or worsened many of the problems associated with drinking. They encouraged alcoholism, which caused many saloon patrons to lose their jobs and invest their lives in the sorrowful consumption of spirits, and they contributed to drunkenness and abusive behavior, all of which only increased the calls for prohibition. By the end of the 19th century, they had evidently garnered enough resistance that a nationwide organization, the Anti-Saloon League, or ASL, was formed in 1893 for the purpose of their destruction, and the greater cause of nationwide prohibition. The ASL soon overshadowed other organizations like the WCTU. It was very well organized and funded, issuing propaganda and quickly gaining political influence. They supported pro-prohibition political candidates, pressured existing politicians to vote for prohibition, and drove the movement forward like never before. Wet advocates held on to whatever arguments they had left, but they were being overwhelmed by their much better organized opponents. A significant portion of these wet Americans were German Americans, who, after the United States joined World War I, were marginalized, leaving remaining resistance to prohibition extremely weak. In 1917, dry members of Congress outnumbered wet congressmen 2-1, and in December of that year, Congress passed a resolution to add a constitutional amendment instigating prohibition. Finally, on January 16th, which is my birthday by the way, 1919, after over a century of activism, supporters of prohibition had finally seen their dream realized. Little did they or anyone realize what a devastating mistake they had just made. Supporters of prohibition entered the year of 1920, in which prohibition went into effect, with great optimism about the success of the 18th Amendment. However, almost immediately, cracks began to form. The law was quickly appealed as it applied to medical prescriptions, after a large movement from doctors who had been prescribing alcohol for various purposes for a long time and didn't want to lose the profit that it generated. The law was nearly impossible to enforce, and crime rates shot up as people resorted to bootlegging or smuggling alcohol across borders. Canada, Mexico, and the Caribbean were more than happy to provide the thirsty Yankees with their drinks, and speakeasies illegally provided alcohol to Americans just like taverns did before Prohibition. Bootlegging became such a big business that it drove the creation of large, organized crime groups and brought people like Al Capone millions in profit. Massive groups of otherwise law-abiding citizens had suddenly become criminals, and even though average alcohol consumption fell, crime rose sharply. Lacking sufficient resources to enforce prohibition, the federal government began poisoning alcohol in an effort to discourage consumption. Many illegal distributors hired chemists to remove the toxins and make the beverages safe to drink, and the government fired back by adding even deadlier poisons to the alcohol. An estimated 10,000 people died as a result of drinking poisoned alcohol throughout Prohibition. This began to sour many on prohibition and the integrity of the federal government. Many wanted to hold the government directly responsible for the murder of those victims of poisoning.
Prohibition was, frankly, a disaster. It was impossible to enforce, and it led to the rise of bootlegging and crime organizations. But maybe the biggest problem it caused was one of economics. The government lost all of the money that it used to collect on legal alcohol sales, and although bootlegging took over where legal selling had left off, the federal and state governments lost millions of dollars per year in taxes they would have collected. Before Prohibition went into effect, taxes from alcohol commerce accounted for a full 14% of local, state, and federal tax revenue. This might not have been so bad, but then, in 1929, the nation plummeted into the largest economic depression in its history. The government now needed money more than ever, and one of its major sources of income was now gone. As a result, politicians began lobbying for the repeal of the 18th Amendment. The people were burned out on Prohibition, and so was the government. A large fight for the repeal gained widespread support, and on December 5, 1933, Utah's Constitutional Convention voted unanimously to ratify the 21st Amendment, officially ending Prohibition.
There was celebration across America. For the first time in 13 years, people could buy legal alcohol and drink it all they wanted. Many of the bootlegging operations simply moved back to legal business, and for the most part, crime rates fell back down and things returned to how they were before in terms of alcohol. And while the revenue from the industry did not end the Great Depression, as some supporters of the repeal claimed it would, it did go a long way to fund the New Deal programs and eventually the war effort. World War II marked a transition to the modern age of alcohol consumption. The newly re-legalized alcohol production boomed, and the Americans who formerly drank mostly whiskey and beer began to branch out. Caribbean rum, which was drank heavily in the colonial period, had a resurgence in popularity, and other spirits like vodka and tequila made their way into American markets. The nation was, of course, still divided on the issue of alcohol consumption. Many supporters of Prohibition appealed to Congress and campaigned to reinstate it, but it was too late. The government was done fighting alcohol, and they much preferred the billions in alcohol-related tax revenue to being pure. America had moved on from Prohibition and had entered the modern age of alcohol. All right, party time. In 1934, in the wake of Prohibition, the average annual alcohol consumption was only 0.97 gallons of pure ethanol per year. Just 2 years later, it had risen to 1.5 gallons per year, and by 1945, the average consumption had reached modern levels, at 2.25 gallons of ethanol per year. During the 1950s and 60s, alcohol continued to become more normalized, as state and local laws were slowly repealed. The last dry state, Mississippi, finally repealed its prohibition law in 1966, making the whole of America wet once again. Even the minimum drinking age was relaxed, with many states lowering it to 18 or 19. This was accepted at the time, as most people consumed alcohol responsibly, but during the 1970s, the rise of counterculture drove the use and abuse of alcohol and other drugs through the roof. In 1975, over 70% of all high school seniors drank alcohol regularly, many of whom were consuming unhealthy amounts of it. Studies in the early 80s showed that underage drinking was a major cause of deadly traffic accidents, and so in 1984, Congress passed the National Minimum Drinking Age Act, which required all states to enforce a minimum drinking age of 21. Since then, alcohol consumption has mostly stayed the same. Alcoholism is still a problem for many people, but for the most part, is simply another part of daily life. Recently, some other drugs that had been illegal for a long time are now being legalized, the most obvious of which being marijuana. The question of whether or not to legalize certain drugs rekindles some of the same arguments that were found in the alcohol debate. They can be harmful to health and livelihood when consumed irresponsibly, and lead to or are associated with poor lifestyle choices. However, they can also be fun and even helpful in moderation. One of the biggest arguments for legalization is that people who abuse these drugs do it whether it's legal or not. According to this argument, the most effective way to prevent abuse is to teach responsible behavior, rather than to ban irresponsible behavior. That way, these drugs can become a source of culture and happiness, rather than a source of decay and sadness. The story of alcohol in American history is one of debate and change. As the public opinion has slowly shifted over time, so has the legal and cultural status of alcohol. Understanding how these changes pertain to the debates around drugs like marijuana now is important to solving these and other such issues in our country. Alcohol has always been an important part of our culture, even when it was banned. Americans have drank it since the very impetus of our history, and remains to this day a crucial part of our society.